Welcome to the Restaurant Relevance Podcast, where the goal is to glean operational tactics for restaurants from data-driven research and possibly nerding out along the way. I'm Nathan Jarvis, the host and creator. Welcome to those of you that are listening and watching. In today's episode, we're featuring research published in the International Journal of Contemporary Hospitality Management entitled Secretless Pastry Chefs on Instagram: The Disclosure of Culinary Secrets in Social Media. I'm super excited to have our guest on the podcast today, really because of a selfish reason. Having worked in pastry many years ago in the back of the house, I really got excited as I was reading the paper and really got interested in reading about what these pastry chefs are doing and how they're using Instagram. So I really hope that those of you that are watching and listening get excited as well. So let's jump right in. We're fortunate to have the lead author of the paper on the podcast today. Mr. ChinKheng Lim is a former pastry commis, cook, and barista. He's currently a PhD candidate in business administration at Oklahoma State University. With 22 publications, and can I just say 22 publications for a PhD student is very impressive. Mr. Lee specializes in culinary and food service research with a focus in aesthetic theories, creativity, and qualitative inquiries. His main research stream focuses on a 4-year, from 2017 to present, narrative project exploring the creative lives and culinary practices of some of Asia's most outstanding pastry chefs, including the 2019 World Pastry Champions. As a teacher, ChinKheng teaches beverage management, culinary skills, pastry, showpieces, and specialty coffee. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me, Dr. Jarvis. It's a very humbling bio that you read over there. But thank you, and I'm just happy to be here. And please just call me Sean.
Sean, awesome. Thank you for being here. It's an honor to have you on. All right, so I want to start at a 30,000-foot viewpoint. In 2 sentences, could you explain what your study was about and then what you found?
All right. So this particular study came about studying how the traditional way culinary knowledge is passed down from one generation of chefs to another. And traditionally, it's very tight-fisted. It's tight-fistedly passed down. It's withheld from one another. But in today's digital era, we are starting to see that this tyranny of tight-fistedness is disappearing, where chefs are actually adopting a more transparent and open philosophy to actually deliver and transmit their knowledge to the next generation. So this study basically studies what is going on in this phenomenon and how it is transmitted throughout the culinary community.
Awesome. That's very interesting. So as I was reading your CV, you've done some really interesting projects over the years. You're working on your PhD right now, but you did your master's at OSU, and you're originally from Malaysia, if I remember correctly, working back of the house. So you have all that industry experience. So how did you come to work on these projects and this one in particular? Like, what was the origin story of this research?
The origin story for this paper, I guess, it stems back to the birth of the big project that I was going forward with. In my master's degree, we had to do a thesis, being a master's student, and I wanted to bring something that was unique to me to the academic world. And I was always inspired by these groups of chefs who, being from Malaysia with almost little historical history of excellence in pastry, never mind culinary, how they excel in the global domain, that just intrigued me. And proud enough, these individuals have some close ties with me. Some of them I proudly call my friends today. And I was just very intrigued with how they create their ideas. It's almost as if they are creating on steroids. It's like creativity on steroids.
Yeah.
They are thinking on a whole different dimensional plane in terms of design, flavor profiles. And the coolest thing was they were sharing. They were openly disseminating all their knowledge everywhere. So I knew that I wanted to talk to these chefs and tell their stories. And through that process of continuous interviews since 2017, with the help of my two co-advisors, Dr. Lee Miao and Dr. Danny Bloom, working alongside them, I start to see different threads of ideas that start to come out, different themes that start to come out. And one of them was the sharing practices. And so that was kind of like a brief abstract of how the idea came about. But I just honed in on that sharing practice and why are they sharing? And they're not sharing simple stuff, they're sharing the whole process of how they're creating, even the recipes online. So that just caught my eye, and I just started from there, started the investigation.
Interesting. And so tell me a little bit about the pastry chefs in this study. I know this came out of a prior study, but what about these pastry chefs? Why'd you select them? And you just reached out to them and said, hey, can I interview you? And they were just willing to? I'm kind of curious about how that went.
So it started off with a friend, and that he is I believe he's the captain of the Malaysian pastry team. His name is Chef WeiLoon. Arguably the most prolific pastry chef today on the planet. Like he's reached the pinnacle of the pastry world right now globally. And so I just approached him and started to understand his world, and he's the main gatekeeper. He's the main gatekeeper who could snowball to the other pastry chefs. So I start talking to his senseis, his masters, his apprentices, the next generation, and I start stalking his Instagram profile, recording things with consent and all that, and I start writing about him. And it's just very cool to see how chefs, especially for the ones from a land that I come from, Malaysia, not many of them are able to articulate their lives. They are doers, they are operators, they are creators, but through food and their actions. When you put them on a podium and ask them to speak, not many of them are able to talk in the same way and bring out the poetics of what they do. So in many ways, just by some preliminary drafts that I've written of them and just starting to explain what I do and how I appreciate their work through my writing, they actually they never thought that they could be represented in that sense. So it started with that, and the snowball happened. So, hey, this guy can write, and if you want to know more about yourself through the interviews that he's going to conduct, why don't you give him a holler and then see where it can go? And that just streamlined into my snowball of extraordinary pastry chefs.
That's amazing.
So to give you a background, to give you a background of who these chefs are, three of them, are currently the World Pastry Champions back in 2019, the most recent World Cup. So, and like I said, they are creators on steroids. They think on a whole different dimensional plane.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay. And I mean, that's just amazing to think about being able to talk to chefs at that level and to be able to try to understand them more, understand their process. I've always had a real interest in where creativity comes from. Being academic, obviously I write, and so I've definitely looked at creativity with regards to writers, but as chefs as well. So we'll talk about your design here in a second, but I want to skip to kind of get real nerdy and philosophical. And you talk about in your paper, you say your interpretation from a philosophical standpoint is based on constructivism and interpretism, which honestly is like, I love the fact that you just make it explicit how you're approaching things from a philosophical standpoint. So not to spend 10 minutes on it, but can you talk a little bit about why you chose that approach philosophically to why how you're doing these interviews?
Well, it's funny that you mentioned that. I don't think someone chooses a philosophy. It's something that you bring to a study. Now, I was trained empirically. I published works that are mainly post-positivist in design, meaning to say very empirical, through data collection, through statistical analysis. We strive for reliability and validity. But there's something that when you approach a topic like creativity and how people perceive the world and how these creators perceive the world, you cannot bring that paradigm into investigating the phenomenon. So when I was looking at these chefs, there was something very intrinsic in me as a chef as well, or as a culinarian myself. I try to not be bounded by traditional means, you know. So when I talk about the constructionist standpoint, the interpretive standpoint, I really realized that I have to approach this in their native language, you know, where we are looking at a phenomenon relative to these participants, at the same time understanding that all the possible truths in the world are multiple, where different people will have different interpretations of the same phenomenon. Now, this doesn't mean that this particular paradigm is better than the other. It just makes more sense to approach this topic from that paradigmatic stance. And so, yeah, that I hope I didn't spend too much on it, but that's basically the essence of it.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. And so that's kind of your philosophy coming in on how you interpret what you found in their posts and in the interviews. And you use a mixed method design, right? That there's a qualitative piece and there's a little bit of quantitative piece in there, looking at posts and number of likes. So can you briefly talk about, well, what was your approach? How did you get this information for your study?
Okay, so the design of the study is Charlene Bible. She mentioned that this is called a nested mixed method design. Mm-hmm. So basically what we do, it's a large qualitative project, okay, but we specifically nest a quantitative portion into that large project. By nesting it, we still follow the philosophical commitments of the bigger qualitative study, but we draw on that data to help make meaning as well. So in essence, this study is qualitatively driven, a big qualitative project. And while we nest a small quantitative portion where we ran regression analysis, just to give us, you know, more of an understanding of the phenomenon. That's the 2 cents of it.
Okay. And so you analyzed, with their permission, their Instagram posts, because this is all about the way they disclose information on Instagram. And you did some coding at one point, and then you go back and you talk to the chefs, kind of to get a sense of, well, are what you were finding in their Instagram posts, is that what they really meant? So you kind of almost aligned what you were finding back with them to make sure you were on the right track. And then you did some quantitative analysis of number of likes and comments on their
That's
posts,
right.
etc. Okay.
Right.
Awesome.
So
and so what is, like, top level, what did you find about their use of of Instagram?
Well, first is just it was a very, very long process, and we had help from it was a very, very long process. We basically, I looked at, so the 9 chefs that I basically interviewed for a long period of time for my large project, I started to notice that specifically 5 of them were engaged in this sharing process where they are openly disclosing their information throughout. And so, but the other 4 were not so much. Now, it doesn't mean that they are not sharers. It's just, they're not just tech savvy. Some of them are just not tech savvy. Some of them, you know, shun social media away from their lives for the evil that it entails. Right. But these 5 in specific were sharing on a different scale. I was like, these are your intellectual properties, and why are you sharing to the rest of the world free of charge on Instagram? Right. And so I started to think about it a little bit more and started to stalk their profiles. I just started scrolling through their profiles and look at all the intricacies of what they're sharing. And from there, I sat down with a colleague. Her name was Rachel. She was acknowledged in the paper for doing that. We kind of came together and started to see the specific themes that were emerging while we were just scrolling. And this is just to get a sense of the data and a sense of their profiles. Right. And then we went into the manual collection process for saving each link into an Excel sheet. We wish we could set up a code on R just to collect data, but Instagram has their algorithm and their privacy settings that does not allow us to do that. So the only way to do it was manually, and it was a painstaking process.
Wow.
So we basically collected down up to, I think, 2,400-ish posts, so about 2,400 posts, and started using our coding lens to see, okay, what do we see? And we start to see that these chefs were not, some of them were just very perfunctory, their posts, meaning to say they're just creating a presence. They say, hey, I'm a public figure, and these chefs are public figures in the culinary domain. And so they might share certain things to just have a presence. But then slowly you start to see they very strategically start to post very, very intellectual pieces, things that discusses their philosophical creativity, and things that discusses how they create their recipes and their designs. So that sparked, that emerged in our study, basically. So through that, we started coding, and then we talked to the chefs, we conducted interviews with them, just to get some feedback on, hey, is this right? Is this not right? We let them have a say in things. And then after that, we also recorded down their likes. And so we were able to trace whether which post generated more likes or has the tendency to generate more likes. So yeah, it was a painstaking process just to extract one data point at a time. And then the writing came about. So
yeah, and all the analysis. All right, well, we'll definitely get here in a few minutes to the answer to the question of, well, what's the correlation between likes and the type of posts? But before we get there, all of this you frame using two theories: one theory of creativity and another theory which I had not heard of before, but now I'm fascinated with. And that is a conceptualization of open source cooking. So can you, summarize for us these two theories? Like, why did you frame your research through the lens of these two?
Well, okay. So first of all, I did a creativity theory to make sure that I have somewhat of a framework that I don't dive into the project, blindly, right? We are always informed somehow. So I went to Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. Many people do not know how to pronounce his name, and perhaps I've even butchered it. But Mihai Csikszentmihalyi's systems view of creativity. And he basically posits that creativity does not happen or does not originate from the creator. No, it doesn't. I mean, we all think that, ideas came out of the blue, we have the epiphany. He posits that it's never that way. It actually comes from a symbolic domain that the person is in. So the domain is the symbolic environment, rich with literature, rich with symbols, or rich with past creators' contributions. And the creator is equipped with this symbolic domain to come up with his epiphanies. He sees new patterns, all right?
Okay. So we're talking the pastry or culinary world is the domain, and the pastry chef is the creator, the person.
Exactly. I couldn't put it any better. So the culinary domain, we have the background of technical skills and things like that. And the pastry chef is building off these technical skills and basis of culinary fundamentals. We can put it that way. The second theory is I wouldn't call it a theory. I'll call it more of a conceptualization. It came from Chad Bokenhagen in a journal. The journal is called Poetics. And he was studying modernist cuisine chefs and how they were, doing the same thing like I was studying. They were basically, he was basically trying to understand why chefs are disclosing the intellectual properties online, not specifically in social media, but on public forums. He was looking at how like Heston Blumenthal and things like that were sharing. And he calls this open source cooking. And the title of the article caught my eye the moment I looked at it. He called it The Death of the Secret Recipe. And I was like, wow, this is something I need to read. And the more I read into it, I start to see my pastry chef's practices reflect his words and his concepts. And then I just started to think, how does this open source cooking conceptualization weave together with Mihai's famed systems view, and it
Right.
breaks all the systems apart. And so using this lens is very open-ended, at the same time gives me enough of a theoretical framework to analyze the phenomenon. So yeah.
Awesome. So I know in reading through your paper and reading about this open source cooking, the conceptualization of it, you discuss the idea that this is very different than having secret recipes, quote unquote, that protect your intellectual property. And I remember thinking, and maybe you even allude to it, and forgive me if you did, then clearly I'm thinking your thoughts. But thinking like open source cooking in a way, putting your recipes, your ideas out on Instagram or on a blog, in one way almost secures your intellectual property more than keeping it hidden, right? Because you've established to the world that you're working on
Absolutely.
this, right? I mean, am I understanding that right?
Absolutely. It's a way of patenting that you are the one who created this. So I'll give you an example. In the pastry world, we always try. There was a particular design, a chocolate design, where a chef would sprinkle just a little bit of cocoa powder on an acetate sheet, and then drizzle it with some colored cocoa butter, and then start to just pave it with a spatula, and we let that and start to pave some tempered chocolate with a spatula, and we start to create this rendered marble effect on the acetate sheet, a marble effect. Now people start to. It's a very replicable skill set. It's a very replicable technique, and people just start to adopt it. But people will always remember where it came from. It was the chef that shared that technical skills specifically. There was another one which was give another example. Frank Hasnut, a very very prominent pastry chef. He was using a turntable to pipe his tarts, and just to give it the spiral effect. And he was celebrated for it. And there was no patenting involved. There was no legality issues involved. There was no paperwork involved. All he did was he posted it on social media, and the right culinarians, the ones with ethical values, and the ones who are at the elite rank and statuses, will always remember that this technique was created by this particular chef.
Right.
And no matter how far it decimated and circulates in the culinary world, we always remember who was the creator. Right. And so, you read my thoughts exactly. It's a way of patenting and gaining a sense of copyright in a very loose sense. You know what I mean? Yeah.
Interesting. All right. So through your study, analyzing all these posts, to what you're just saying, right? You find a theme or a general topic of creative ethics, which I definitely want to talk about because I find that interesting. And there's some aspects of the disclosure of culinary secrets, and you break that down into 3 groupings. And then you talk about like a perfunctory, like just posting something to have a presence on social media. I think I hit those 3 main categories, and I know disclosure of culinary secrets has like 3 categories underneath that you found. So can you talk about kind of these main categories of what you found, and then maybe we can dive deeply into a couple of them?
For sure. So when we talk about what I found through the entire analytical process qualitatively was number one, they start to have being a social media, I would like to use the word very, very loosely, influencer in the culinary community. I need to use that term very lightly, or they will come back to get me. There are public figures in the domain. They need to continue to establish themselves as a public figure on Instagram. So they would share certain posts that are more of a shrug off, more perfunctory, just to tell people, hey, I'm still here. I'm still creating. These are some throwbacks that I did like 6 months ago. Oh, it's a throwback from a year ago. I love this pastry. And so they were posting things like that just to establish a presence and ensure that they have a continual presence, basically.
Right.
The second category was about creative ethics. Now, that was something that was very interesting in a sense that they always reference and cite where their ideas come from. That's the coolest thing. They recognize that they are not creating out of the blue, but they cite where their inspirations come from. And that was just amazing. And that was like, what? It's almost like a scholarly process, how we cite people and make sure we don't steal other people's ideas. They were doing the same thing, but through food. So that's like the second thing that really caught my eye. And the third one is what I like to call the holy grail of knowledge sharing. It's the full secrets disclosure.
Right.
They start to disclose the flavors that were guiding their creative process. Okay, and sometimes we take this for granted. When you buy a recipe book, we are not really looking for how you made the dish. For a culinarian like you and me, we are not looking at how you make the dish. We're actually looking at what is combined. Why are you adding this into this? What does this do to the other one? We're looking at flavor pairings and flavor complexities that triggers more thoughts. We're not going to replicate the whole recipe from scratch from you. We are just going to getting ideas. So they were disclosing that aspect of flavor to everyone. So that was one part of the secret disclosure. The second one is the process. Now, Instagram, I think since the late decade, they allowed videos to be embedded into their posts. Yeah. So these chefs were actually sharing the process of how they were made.
Right.
And it comes with a lot of preliminary understandings. As a chef, when you look at it, you start to see how they roll their pastry, what piping nozzle did they use, what specific tools did they use, what kind of, how was this design rendered?
Right.
That was all showcased throughout the process through video form. And the last one really, really shocked me was recipe disclosure. They would post the full recipe on Instagram, or implicitly or explicitly. Some people just screenshot it off their Word document and post it as a secondary image in their album post. Some link their recipes to a website. And it was like, why are you doing this? Again, the idea just came to me. Why are you doing this? And there are actually safety measures that they take to make sure that, it doesn't dilute from what they intend. They may be sharing, but they also know that not many people can replicate them.
Yeah.
And so it was very cool in that sense. So that was the 3 categories. Sorry.
No. I mean, I totally see that, because even if, having worked back of the house, right? I mean, even if someone posts all the pictures, videos of the technique, and the ingredients and the amounts, all of it, there's only a certain number of people that can actually pull that off, have the skills to do it. And they're probably also well known enough that if they were to then go post that somewhere and act like it's their own, they're going to be called out for it, right? Which I guess gets into this ethics side of things.
Right.
So I'm talking more about that because I remember as a cook, there being these conversations about, well, you always learn from your mentors, right? And you brought recipes with them. So, what's allowed to use and how do you credit them? So I find that ethics portion really interesting.
The cool thing about this, Dr. Jarvis, is, it's not only that they need the skills to replicate it, they also need the infrastructure to replicate it. One of my chefs, they mentioned in a quotation in an interview, you need my toys to make my toys. I'm not afraid of letting them have the recipe. They don't have the toys that I have to make them. And it's very true. They invest in technology that only they have, which is very fascinating. Back to your question about that, the ethical side of things. You're right. Chefs are very mobile creatures. You can only learn so much from one organization, one establishment, and sometimes it's time to go to learn new things from a new establishment. And we bring these qualities, these experiences, these intellectual properties from the first establishment to the next. And how do you ensure that? And so how do you ethically share this knowledge? Now, so through this particular study, when I look at it, they would, number one, through Instagram, they would tag the original
Okay.
creator.
Right.
I think one of my cases, or one of my exemplar posts that I shared in the paper specifically, was Chef ChinKheng Lim. Now he's just a fascinating creator. He takes flavors, I think he sees the world flavorfully. He just looks at things in in flavors. I know, like
Right.
David Bowie sees the world in colors and music notes. I think he sees the world in like flavors. And he takes flavor to an extreme heights, but he always makes sure that if he's building off something, he cites them. So he replicated a recipe called the Ispahan macaron by Pierre Hermé, one of the French revolutionists in the pastry world, known specifically in the 21st century for macarons, right?
Right.
And now the Ispahan had lychees, has rose, has a good mix of raspberries into it. It's just a very floral flavor aspect to it. Now ChinKheng notices that this is not his original recipe, and if he claims it for his own and calls it something else, he's going to be called out.
Yeah.
So when he posted something like that on Instagram, he took such a beautiful picture. Immediately he posted right at the bottom, this is called the Ispahan. It entails of raspberries. It entails of a macaron shell. It entails lychees and rose flavored. At the very bottom, he tagged the original recipe is from Pierre Hermé. And in that way, he portrays some form of epistemic humility, telling people that this is based off another person's work and that he is not the original creator, but he's just a replicator. There's nothing wrong with that, right? And I think it goes back to, if I can give a very layman example, how people can be very protective of their family recipes. And if somebody shares with you, my family, I don't know, green pea casserole, and you just share it off to your neighbors, I mean, if the initial person were to find out, she was not going to be pleased whatsoever. So it carries on. It's a sense of morality, and I call this I term it creative ethics, but it's really down to the morality of the creators, recognizing that creativity doesn't happen out of the blue. It is always based off a domain. So yeah.
Well, and that doesn't take away from the value of the creation, right? That secondary creation. I mean, we do this in academia all the time, right? We cite other people to build on what we're working on. In fact, probably if you analyze most of our papers, over half of the paper is all referencing someone else and talking about what they did and what we did. So, but it's so neat to see that that's being actively propagated, and talked about, that you're talking about it and studying it. So interesting. Okay. So you also talk about this disclosure of culinary secrets, particularly flavor disclosure. And I want to ask you about this because I find the combinations, talking about the flavors that are in a dish are greatly important. But as I was reading your paper, I also thought about, in the past, let's say 20 years, with the growth of whether you call it modernist cuisine or whether you call it molecular gastronomy or whatever, however you want to describe that movement. We have chefs. The one that comes to mind is Chef Achatz at Alinea, that write whole menus that are basically just lists of flavors, right? I had the honor of dining at Alinea once and got the menu, right? And it's a list of flavors in each dish. And so there's almost a paradigm in one sense of chefs disclosing these flavor profiles. But can you talk a little bit more about this flavor disclosure and what you found?
Of course. And wow, like when you brought Chef Greg Achatz to the table, to our conversation, it's very true. It's very true. I think we must first define what flavor is to a chef. A lot of people think, especially in today's world, we think about a chef as, the glamour, the people on the television, or Or in another paradigm would be the hard worker, the laborer, the doer, the person who can never rest on their laurels and is always doing something, the craftsman, right? But at their very core, a true culinarian, I use the word culinarian to describe a serious pupil of culinary arts, one that's dedicated to the arts and to push the boundaries of the culinary domain. A chef's goal is to discover flavors, reinterpreting old ones, or finding new pairings that we never thought about. And it's very true when we talk about Ackert's, Chef Ackert and his menu design, just a list of flavors. Many chefs do that too. And to these chefs, this particular group of chefs that I interviewed, flavor is the epitome of why they create, nothing else. They are looking for new ways to pair things, because pastry specifically, people think about it as butter and sugar deep fried in flour. You know what I mean? It's just, everything is just sweet sensations, and it's just bad for you. Your dentist hates you. But true enough, there's a new movement of pastry. Pastries can be extremely flavorful too. It's just that we are always clouded by the need of more fat, more whipped cream, and more sugar. That's not true for these chefs. They are trying to bring in pastry almost like a hot cuisine sense, and showcase that pastry is actually a celebration of flavor.
Right.
So flavor, in my paper and some of the previous works that I work with my collaborators, we kind of collectively define it as a chef's ultimate weapon. The reason why they create, the rightful soul of the chef rests in the discovery of flavor. And that's why they were disclosing those flavor profiles. And just to give people a new sense of thinking about the flavor equation, to use the Flavor Bible's words, by Karen Page. It's a way of rethinking what things can pair well and what things do not. And they are just showcasing the different combinations. Flavor is also what many, many young chefs or young culinarians or young culinary students do not look at. They are too consumed by the acquisition of skills and recipes. That's not why you become a culinarian. I think it's to discover new gustatory sensations through the palate. And that was why flavor disclosure became such a prominent theme in the paper. We saw that every time they post something, they would list down the components of it, so that other people can build off on.
Right.
You know.
Fascinating. Well, and to your point about, young culinarians, right, and their focus on techniques, a lot of it is, you have to, at least my opinion, is you have to know the basics to be able to create.
Of course.
I took piano lessons as a child, did not appreciate them at the time, but was, always told that before you can go compose, right, or do whatever you want to, you first have to learn the scales, right? You have to learn the rules before you know how to break them. And I think the same thing applies to the culinary field, where you have to know the techniques. You have to know the standard flavor combinations, which the only way to know that is through experience, right? Tasting things. And then once you've done that, then you can go from there and you can build new flavor combinations or perfect the old ones. At least that's my thought process.
Oh, I totally agree. We always, gathering the technicalities is very, very important for a young culinarian. And we always think that flavors are through, hitting the streets and tasting more things, right? So these chefs are trying to streamline this disclosure, making you think about the equations that go in their mind.
Yeah.
And a lot of people even like me, we take it for granted that, hey, I didn't know that this and this paired well. Who knew? Who knew that, vanilla paired well with salted butter? And it's just, we never thought about it in that sense before. So, yeah.
Yeah. Awesome. Okay. So you did all this qualitative work and all these really interesting themes came out. I think we could talk about this for hours, but in the interest of not making this a 3-hour long conversation, you also analyze these posts, right? And in your paper, you talk about trying to analyze them for quote unquote social value, right? Whether they have value to society. How did you do that? And what did you find on the quantitative piece?
Okay, so after we categorize all the types of posts that were posted, and we also collected down the number of likes each post gathered, and we basically ran some hierarchical regression analysis. Dr. Tao, my co-author, Dr. WeiLoon Tan, championed that area. I am absolutely not statistically inclined one bit. I know enough just to get me in trouble. Right. So I had to consult him, and he championed that part of the nested design. So I believe, and I think the paper, you can correct me if I'm wrong, we had several control variables. We controlled the number of followers because each profile had different number of followers. We controlled the number of posts that they have, and we controlled the number of followings that they followed.
Right.
And then we set all these postage, all these themes as independent variables, and we tested them hierarchically in a regression model to see whether they have a correlation to the number of likes received. So the number of likes serve as an indication whether these posts were socially valued in the Instagram domain that they operate in. And we found that two specific themes of postings has a higher propensity to generate more likes. And that would be the process review and the recipe review. People go gaga when somebody shows them how to do something, and the likes just chimes in. What we found very interesting, however, although none of them was statistically significant, the flavor, the creative ethics, and the creative presence were not statistically significant. We found that flavor actually had a negative correlation to their number of likes, where they actually generate some lesser likes, but it's not statistically significant at all. It's not statistically, so it's a very, but it is shown that they have a propensity to generate lesser likes. Now, when we try to rationalize this, we noticed that, number one, on Instagram, not only other culinarians follow them, the general public follows them. Now, they do not have the deciphering ability that a culinarian might have. And number two is that, okay, again, you need a trained lens to actually appreciate flavor. Not everybody sets out to look for, I want to look for flavor profiles. No, they scroll through Instagram for the nice pictures and the techniques that they can learn. Yeah. So that may have contributed to it. But the two biggest things that were more socially valued was when they disclosed the process of how it's done through a video form and through the recipes that they share. So yeah.
So to make it very applied, if I were, let's say I'm a PR person for a restaurant or for a chef, and part of our strategy is to increase the presence that my chef has on Instagram, and therefore, increase the social value that our chef and our restaurant has. I should definitely work with our chef to post things on Instagram that are more process and recipe related, based on your findings, that would more likely get us more likes than some of these other things.
Exactly. I think that's a very good implication that we can take out from this particular study that we conducted. I mean, we can think about when Gordon Ramsay posted certain things, we actually want to see him cook. We actually want to see him do something apart from the barking and the screaming. We actually want to see him do those kind of things, and that actually generates more social value sometimes. There's another chef that I keep on thinking about. Do you know the pastry chef at near who just established a pastry school in Las Vegas, Chef Amaury Gouchon?
The name is very familiar.
He's a social media beast, and his post is just ongoingly disclosing processes and disclosing the how-to his designs, his chocolate designs and his sugar designs. And those are very socially valued. So in a way, when you say that, those are actually generating millions and millions of likes on Instagram, creating a big presence for him. So if you think about from a restaurateur's perspective or an operator's perspective, how can we get people to create more of a presence of our establishment? Definitely showing the transparency that goes behind the dish showing that things are made from scratch, showing the process and all the hard work that a culinary team puts together for a final dish. It actually creates a better presence, and not only that, it creates transparency for the public domain.
Interesting. All right, so normally what I ask my guests towards the end is, okay, so based on your research, what would you do if you owned a restaurant or operated a restaurant? And I know you have previews of what I'm going to ask you here because I sent you these questions, but I feel like there's actually 3 questions that I need to ask you here. So first one would be, so what would you do as a cook or a chef to use your research with regards to sharing on social, and what's the value in doing so? I think we just alluded to it, but like, what would you do if you wanted to follow these techniques?
If one were to read this particular paper, I mean, if one were to go through the process of painfully reading through an academic paper, there are actually values that you can pick up from this, especially if you are a culinarian. And I use the word cook, chef, students, they all encompass together into one particular term that I call culinary, a serious pupil to culinary arts. And I would say from this paper, I hope that it equips you with a way of seeing the minutiae of life, the minutiae of the culinary world, especially on social media. We are all consumed on social media, but sometimes we have to look for meaning through social media. And sometimes when these chefs post something, there are certain things that they are implicitly or explicitly disclosing, and also implicitly. And so instead of just pushing the like button and scrolling down to the next post, why don't we take a slow ontology to processing that and understand, hey, so I didn't know that he paired duck breasts with beet puree. What does that combination tell? And what is this chef trying to send as a message to the culinary domain? The elite chefs have achieved a particular status where sometimes most of them, I can't speak for all of them, but they are in a way trying to give back and pay it forward to the next generation. That's the only way the culinary community sustains. And so by reading through this paper, hopefully they see flavor profiles differently. They process the disclosure of different facets differently. And most importantly, please have creative ethics. Don't just steal and claim for your own. Nothing is yours originally. It always stems back to a body of existing works. So I think that's a very long, winding explanation to how one can equip it, can learn from my study, basically, or Dr. Tao and I study.
Yeah, so, I mean, to kind of recap, and honestly, you kind of answered all of my questions all at the same time, which is great, right? Like, if you're, as we talked about, if you're a chef and you want to disclose things, currently, process and recipes tend to get the most traction. But if you're a cook, a culinarian, to use your term, a student, or, and you're trying to learn, you're saying you need to slow down and pay more attention to what people are posting so that you can learn from them. And then to extend it a little bit, I was thinking about this morning as I was rereading your paper, is as a culinary teacher, right? Because I'm an educator, I know you're an educator, and there are lots of educators out there hopefully listening, right? And I'm going to extrapolate here, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. I think going from what you're saying, as educators, we have to show students some of these things and help them connect the dots, like help them extrapolate from what they're seeing on Instagram and saying, well, here's what chef so-and-so is missing. This is what they didn't post in the recipe, right? Or this is the setup that they didn't talk about they have, and how do you figure that out? And then obviously the creative ethics conversation is super important in education as well. Is that a fair assessment as educators?
Absolutely.
How we should apply this?
Absolutely. I think that's a huge transferable quality from this particular study. And I think we also had a paragraph dedicated specifically for culinary educators that hopefully spark some ideas to how one can approach social media as a reputable and rich medium for teaching and learning. But also one thing that I could add to that specifically,
please,
is because because of Instagram, there's a churn of fast knowledge. Not everything posted out there is valuable knowledge. There are some absolutely valueless facts. Not to call out certain medium or whatsoever, but there are some things that fall in what I do not consider as culinary arts, but in the more layman's term, food porn and things like that is not really a culinarian's spirit.
Right.
You know what I mean? Right. So not only to identify what is valuable, but also what is not. And that's also one thing we have to bear in mind.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you pointed that out. I think that's super important. I mean, I do that to create an analogy. I do that when I'm teaching students how to write a paper, right? Like, let's go to Google. Let me show you how to find academic literature, and let me show you how to identify the stuff that's not academic literature, right? Wikipedia does not count as an academic source, unless, of course, you're studying Wikipedia. But awesome. All right, so you talk about in your paper at the end, like what this gives the culinary world, and then you talk a little bit about like what you would want to know next. So are you going to expand on this study, do something else, and like what's next to know in this realm of research?
So Dr. Tao and I are actually working on a new piece. It's actually near completion. The summertime is a perfect time to write. It's near completion. Yeah. We isolate, and we really want to expand on the ethical side of things and the cultural social responsibility that this open source cooking phenomenon instigated. So I can give you just a little preview. Because I study the Malaysian pastry chefs. Now, they come from a background and a backdrop with very little historical excellence in the world of pâtissier. Now, however, they have achieved the absolute pinnacle of creative excellence, being the champion in 2019. And it came with a lot of social responsibility and cultural responsibility, not only to the domain of pastry, but also to their nation, and also to their heritage as a Malaysian. And that came with so much hidden duties and hidden values that he has to portray. So using this similar theoretical lens and the final model that we created called the systems view of culinary knowledge sharing, I hone in on the team captain, Chef WeiLoon Tan, very, very good friend. And I start to see how he is equipping himself with this pastry ambassadorship, global pastry chef ambassadorship that he just acquired as the world champion, and how he is disseminating knowledge about Malaysian pastry ethically to the next generation of chefs. So that was one thing that Dr. Tao and I are kind of conceptualizing, using a lot of past interview transcripts. And alongside, we are also looking at his recent creations. He's showcasing Malaysian native ingredients through the French pâtissier twist. Just seeing what that entails. Yeah.
Fascinating. All right. Well, we'll have to wait for your upcoming paper on that, and maybe have you back on to talk about that as well. Really, really fascinating. Anything else you want to add?
I think we covered all the borders. I just want to say I have major respect for what you do, Nathan. I think this is a podcast that I will definitely tune into on a weekly basis, depending on when the episodes are released. I think food researchers or restaurant researchers are kind of underrepresented in the larger hospitality and tourism domain that we function in. Never mind culinary researchers, right? And I think you just gave me a great platform to share, and hopefully it reaches the right people. And so I have mad respect for what you do, Dr. Jarvis.
Thank you. And likewise, I mean, reading your paper and hearing some of the interviews you're doing, I mean, it's really fascinating. I was telling my wife yesterday, getting ready for this, I was like, he's doing stuff that I wish I was doing. So no, total respect for the research that you're doing, the methods you're using. I look forward to tracking your career and see the other stuff that you're doing. So Thank you so much for being on the show today, taking the time. I really do appreciate it. For those of you that are listening, thank you for listening and watching. If you have comments or questions, please email me at nathan@restaurantrelevance.com. Ciao.